Unlocking Nigeria's economic prosperity demands courage, creativity, and consistency. The journey will be tough, with no shortcuts, as the country grapples with challenges like high inflation, weak foreign reserves, depreciating naira, low productivity, rising energy costs, and a struggling job market. Many analysts, however, aver that while some relief may come, especially in the second half of 2025, economic conditions will remain challenging in the short term. Teslim Shitta-Bey, the chief economist at ProShare, joins me for more on this. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me, and Happy New Year to everybody.
Happy New Year to you too. Well, let's take a look at this. Here are some of the socio-economic, or you might say macroeconomic issues that Nigerians had to grapple with in 2024. Number one, we have high domestic inflation, relatively low foreign reserves. Though there has been significant accretion to the reserve, I mean, you probably want to disaggregate that to say how much of that is constrained by obligations, if you may. But we also have falling output and productivity, weak job markets, depreciating foreign value of the naira, lower disposable income, and rising energy costs. These were challenges that plagued businesses, individuals, and households last year. Will these things soften in 2025?
Okay, thank you for the question. I guess you've highlighted most of the challenges faced by the Nigerian economy in 2024, and those challenges will persist in 2025. You noted the high inflation rate, you noted the relatively low foreign reserve situation, and perhaps one thing you didn't mention was the unemployment rate, which has also been rising gradually. So Nigeria is caught in a perfect storm. Economists call this the trilemma. And that's a situation where you have low growth in employment, you see a situation of high levels of inflation, and you see your capital flows being relatively low. So we call this the trilemma. How do we cope with it? What needs to be done? I think those are the fundamental issues that must be addressed as quickly as possible to provide Nigerians with the popular dividend of democracy. We've seen GDP growth grow steadily over time. 2024, we saw GDP grow steadily. That was positive. That was on the side of the equation. However, inflation has been a perennial pain for most of the 2024 period. Now, in ProShare, one of the major concepts that we have basically is that if we're going to solve the domestic inflation problem, we certainly have to resolve the foreign reserves situation. Our calculations from our model, our internal model, our calculations suggest that 65% of domestic inflation rate can be directly attributed to our foreign reserve situation. And that explains why, despite the repeated increase in monetary policy rate, that is the rate the central bank uses as an indicative rate for the economy, that has grown consistently from 17.5% to the current rate. We haven't seen a reduction in inflation. The central bank governor has tried as much as he can with his team to reduce inflation by increasing domestic interest rates. But what that has done is to constrain domestic businesses, facilitating a poorer employment situation, and at the same time not achieving the goal it intended, which is to curb domestic inflation. And for our model, the answer is quite simple. Nigeria needs to look at how it can improve its foreign reserve situation. Without improving that foreign reserve situation, no matter how high monetary policy rates rise, we are not going to see significant reduction in inflation. However, there's a caveat there. The federal government has said that it intends to rebase, which means that it's not going into technical details. It's basically looking at a different composition of those things that constitute inflation and seeing how it actually now affects consumer price index in the country. Now, that rebasing should see some improvement in the inflation
Mr. Shitta-Bey, Mr. Shitta-Bey, talking about the rebasing, we'll come to that. They want to rebase the GDP and the CPI. We'll come to that later. But still on foreign reserves, rather, some projections have said, the foreign reserves must rise by at least, 50% to $60 billion, while analysts' preferred level is between $80 billion and $120 billion for inflation to even get to the CBN's 21.4% target. Now, talk to us. How can this actually be achieved? You know, I mean, what I'm talking about now, how do we get to that 60 within this short period of time? Is it achievable? And some might also want to know the relationship between the two, you know, how the reserves sort of affect the inflation.
Okay, great. That's a very interesting question. Most economists we've spoken to are rather skeptical about the ability to increase foreign reserves as quickly as possible. We have a different view. We have an optimistic view. And what we are saying is that the government simply needs to revision and reimagine the economy. What the government has done so far is to concentrate on what we call the income statement, expenditure and revenue. Or how much comes in from the oil and gas sector? How much comes in from the non-oil sector? Then we also look at how much are we spending on recurrent expenditure, that is on wages, salaries, maintenance of government properties, etc., etc. Our argument is we need to remove ourselves from that straitjacket, remove ourselves from income-centric approaches to fiscal management. What does that mean, basically? Simple. We have a balance sheet. And our argument is basically let the Nigerian nation, let the federal government use its balance sheet. Let me give you a typical example. A family has 3 houses, a Rolls Royce, and perhaps a Bugatti. However, as a result of the difficulties of economic situation, it finds it difficult to have cash available to buy its daily needs. So what does the family do? Does the family go out and say, you know what, let's go and start working harder and see how we can get some more money in? No. The sensible thing to do for the family is to use its assets. You don't need to drive a Bugatti. You don't need 3 cars. You don't need the 3 houses anyway. So you only live in one, right? So why not sell? And so our argument is this. The government should sell down its joint venture assets. It should also sell down idle assets. And then it should do something that it has not done. And it's not a problem of this government. It's a problem of governments over time. Why does Nigeria not have a public entity listed on an exchange in Nigeria, perhaps abroad? There is absolutely no public exchange listed on the capital market in Nigeria.
Mr. Shitta-Bey, are you still there?
See improvement in foreign revenues that go into our foreign reserves. Sorry, your line's breaking.
Oh, okay. So, Mr. Shitta-Bey, you were talking about selling assets. So, which assets do you or are you looking at right now? And how much do you project Nigeria gets from doing that? Mr. Shitta-Bey, can you hear me? All right, so basically we're looking at engendering or seeing prosperity in Nigeria in 2025, and we have started by looking at some of the challenges that the economy faced in 2024, and we're looking at how to make things better. And he said, you know what, we've got to do something different, and that is probably selling assets. We know that the federal government had mulled that before now, but what we do not know is how far the federal government is moving to get that done. He also talked about how it's important to have some of these assets, not the ones we're selling now, probably listed, you know, on the exchange. And of course, we're hearing that NNPC, well, we're told that NNPC was going to be listed. That hasn't happened yet. And of course, we're also still looking forward to that to see if that is going to happen. There are so many things really. Also looking at the foreign exchange reserve, talking about what we have right now isn't good enough. And that the projection of $60 billion by 2025, he's probably saying that while some persons are saying it's not as easy or it may not be possible, he thinks it will be possible. My question to him would have been, are we going to look at this to be sure of the composition first before then projecting? So at the end of the day, it's not hot money we're using to raise these reserves at the end of the day. And Mr. Shitta-Bey, if you can hear me, I'd like you to please comment on this.
Okay, I was off for a minute there. Could you slightly dial back so that I heard you talk about the reserves.
All right, interesting. So I asked you a question about the reserves, the connection it has with inflation, and then you started talking about, how that the federal government focuses on income statement and all of those, and then you started talking about how that it's important that we also see the sale of assets. And before you went offline, I was asking you what assets are you looking at, selling, and then how much do you project that Nigeria raises from this, and how sustainable that is at the end of the day?
Okay, let's put this in perspective. You have a Saudi Arabian economy that has $450 billion in external reserves. Now, Saudi Arabia, a few years back, decided to take a small percentage of its Saudi Aramco company to the New York Stock Exchange. Currently, the Saudi Aramco shares on the New York Stock Exchange is valued at $2 billion, $2 trillion. So for us, I'm looking at the NNPC, and we're saying that, can we get the NNPC to be listed on an exchange? And so we have an open market value for that asset. Several other idle assets that the federal government has in place that it can sell off. And when we talk about sell off, we're not saying sell off 100% of that asset. Saudi Arabia didn't sell off 100% of Saudi Aramco. What we're saying is that take a slice of that asset and sell it off. And we're talking about the joint venture agreements. Pare down the extent to which you have equity contributions into those JVs. You can pare it down, release dollars, and use those. It's about releasing the dollars and using those dollars constructively to rebuild your foreign reserves and to stimulate development and growth in the country. For instance, I've heard you talk about $60 billion, and I smiled. Why? Because as at 2007, when the President Olusegun Obasanjo was in power, was about leaving power, Nigeria had $40 billion in external reserves. It had an excess crude account fund of $20 billion, giving us a combined $60 billion in reserves. And most of these reserves were unencumbered by the forward commitments. Now, I'm sure we've all read the JP Morgan analysis for 2023, where we saw that, yes, we had a reserve of about $30 billion, but net reserves was just $3.7 billion. Now, that's not the kind of economy we need to stimulate growth, improve productivity, and reduce domestic inflation. If we're going to do that, our net reserve assets need to increase sizably. And what we're saying is that improve that reserve by paring down your assets, especially assets that are considered idle. Let me give you a quick example. The National Stadium Surulere is there. What revenue comes to the federal government from that stadium as it is today? And I'll just use this as an example. There's several other projects, over 1,000 across the Federation of Nigeria.
All right, Mr. Shitta-Bey,
we need to assess these.
All right. There's a lot to talk about. I want to bring you to the fiscal sustainability conversation before we then go to the rebasing. Now, fiscal sustainability feels threatened with, ballooning debt. We have seen the crowding out of the private sector, and revenue doesn't seem to be doing as good or as well. You've also, alluded to that. The 2025 budget shows over 16 trillion naira is set aside for debt servicing. There is an over 13 trillion naira deficit. You might also want to add the controversial tax reform bills, which we were thinking would also help to grow maybe tax revenue. Doesn't all of this look gloomy already?
It looks difficult, but not gloomy.
Okay.
Why we're saying this is basically, yeah, it looks difficult, but it's not gloomy. Obviously, we need to reduce debt servicing obligations. United States of America has a total debt of over 1% of its GDP. However, its debt servicing is actually 8 to 9% of GDP growth. So in that context, when you have debt servicing as high as it is in Nigeria, it is obviously worrisome. However, it is not impossible to deal with. We can deal with this situation. And one of the ways that I've talked about earlier is to assess our assets. We can use our assets that are idle, convert them into dollars, pay down some of those debt obligations, and then free up our foreign reserves.
Right.
Such that you find your net foreign reserve position be increasingly positive.
All right.
And then you talked about the fiscal.
All right, Mr. Shitta-Bey, I want us to move quickly. I want us to move quickly right now. Let's take a look at the rebasing. I mean, there are concerns in some quarters about the rebasing of the GDP and inflation. And while we know that rebasing is important, do we have any cause to fear that it may yield an exaggerated GDP and then maybe a reduced inflation? Is that something we should be worried about?
Interestingly enough, really and truly, with the foreign exchange rate where it is, we don't actually see an exaggerated GDP going into 2025 and beyond. Of course, I would say that last GDP rebasing exercise in 20 resulted into an increase in our GDP of about 60%, and that resulted in an output adjustment in our GDP valuation to nearly $500 billion. That placed Nigeria at the top of Africa in terms of GDP. This exercise may not necessarily be the same. And then one point I would really quickly want to raise is that GDP by global standards should be rebased every 5 years. That's 5 to 8 years. But as a matter of fact, our proposition is that GDP rebasing should be annual if possible. Because of our side. And because of the volatility that we see in the system, we would love to have a situation where we can rebase. So when I compare GDP in 2024 with 2025, I'm actually comparing apples and apples rather than apples and oranges. So I think rebasing is necessary. I think it's long overdue, actually. That's the position of ProShare. We feel that the rebasing is necessary. It's been long overdue. And the earlier we keep rebasing until we get some element of stability in domestic inflation, GDP growth, as well as our foreign reserve position, the better.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Teslim Shitta-Bey, Chief Economist, ProShare. I think we will have to end this here. Thank you so much for your time on the show today.